This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. It is another in my trilogy on the nature of happiness. I am speaking with theologian Brent Strawn, and the conversation will begin in a moment. Happiness is the topic, and Brent Strawn is a professor at Emory University, and he has also written about the subject of happiness, amongst other things. He is a theologian. And Brent, if I could ask you to take a few minutes, give a little bit of a personal background about yourself, your ideas on happiness, and anything pertinent to the subject that's in your book, which is the Bible and the Pursuit of Happiness.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. It's great to be with you. I've taught here at Emory University since 2001. I'm professor of Old Testament here at the Candler School of Theology and in the Graduate Division of Religion. I'm also affiliated with the Department of Middle Eastern and South Asian Studies and a senior fellow with the Center for the Study of Law and Religion. The Bible in Pursuit of Happiness volume that I edited for University Press came out as part of that project through the Center for the Study of Law and Religion. They had a large multi-year project devoted to the pursuit of happiness, and the Bible in Pursuit of Happiness project emerged out of that. It came out of some of the contributors who were working on that larger project combined with others, and we put this volume together. I edited it and wrote some extended materials, introductory and concluding materials about happiness in light of the smaller project that we convened around the Bible and the question of happiness in light of positive psychology.
It was my error. I should have said editor rather than writer. So let me just ask a little bit about happiness and a theological approach to it. In a prior interview, I talked about how the U.S. Constitution guarantees the right to pursue happiness as sort of a civil sense. I grew up as a Missouri Synod Lutheran, and for me, when I grew up watching like this little cartoon called Davy and Goliath, this little Gumby-like figures, and happiness was always presented as something that you do for others rather than a pursuit for oneself, i.e. Hedonism is not real happiness. That real happiness comes from helping your neighbor, assisting the poor, doing God's or Jesus's work or whatnot. Yet modern society seems to be antithetical to that. How do you, what is happiness in your theological point of view? Is happiness more what you get given to yourself or what you put out?
That's a great question. I think it's partly has to be answered right in multiple ways. I mean, there's now this robust literature on what constitutes happiness in the positive psychology movement, and we drew on the positive psychology movement in these essays devoted to the Bible and the pursuit of happiness. And I think you're right about our common understanding of the pursuit of happiness being something that we, drive ourselves towards or we seek after. Though I was taken by this essay by Arthur Schlesinger, which argues that in its context in the 18th century, that language, the pursuit of happiness, is not a striving after it, but actually an obtaining of happiness. That's what we are all guaranteed as American citizens: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Really, the achieving an experience of happiness. But then, as you say, this is just to raise the question of what is real happiness. And there are these rather ascetic and strict understandings of happiness. They live in Christian theology, not only in the Missouri Synod, but more broadly, that are quite ascetic and strict and denying, world denying. But I think what is important about the project we did here in this book was to realize that that's only really one part of the Bible's portrait of happiness, and there are these other parts that are not entirely hedonistic in the most, in the worst case scenario, as we might portray it now, but are also completely unrelated to the pursuit of the pleasures of life, and that in fact the Bible has both of these in its pages, and in some ways pursues them in what Jack Lapsley, one of our contributors, called a happy blend of hedonistic and these eudaimonistic tendencies or definitions of happiness.
Well, I mean, obviously, I guess for most people who are lay people like myself, I'm not religious now, but the incident of Sodom and Gomorrah in the Bible, where people are pursuing their hedonistic pleasures or whatnot, seems to argue, if you're a literalist or even if you just look at the Bible as a series of useful parables, that real happiness doesn't come from simply pursuing sex and drinking and gambling and carousing and whatnot. How is the fable, if we'll call it, of Sodom and Gomorrah useful in a modern setting?
Well, I don't know if that one is so useful, because I think the way that story is set up is quite clearly presented as something that the whole city of Sodom is portrayed as wicked. Its wickedness is rising up to God. That's why God is concerned with it. So I don't think that story is presented in a positive light, really, in any way. But something like the book of Ecclesiastes does actually portray a lot of just like this worldly pursuits through, as happiness in and of itself in this life, in this world. So, even though this would be the pursuit of great works, doing great things, having lots of stuff, having lots of friends, and including in the book of Ecclesiastes, have lots of sexual pleasure. But that book also points out that none of those things ultimately satisfy the author of the book in his pursuit of the good life. So that it's not just stuff, again, in the kind of our contemporary understanding of hedonism, but a larger eudaimonistic framework that can recognize really good things. For Kohelet, it would be, say, good wine, and good friends, and good work, but never those things solely as an entity or end in and of themselves. So the hedonism is truly an aspect of happy life, going all the way back to Aristotle, but only one part of happy life, and can't be magnified or trumped up on its own such that it gets out of control at the expense of non-hedonic aspects of life.
We're recording this just a week and a day shy of Christmas in 2016, and I know as a boy, one of the early things on television I saw was the Charlie Brown Christmas, where almost 50 years ago there was the lamentation about the over-commercialization of Christmas, the losing of the true meaning. And, certainly in the last half century, that rift has seemingly gotten bigger with things like, Black Friday sales after Thanksgiving and this and that, all these things designed to sell. And you see people will be lining up, tearing at each other to get the best deals or whatnot. Do you see that there is some kind of a rift between the definition of secular happiness and the non-secular happiness? And if so, is there a way to bridge that?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And I think it's true to an extent. I would say that a lot of the secular studies of happiness in positive psychology are precisely that. They're not religious, right? They're not pursued for religious ends. And they, too, have demonstrated that there is more to life than just sort of these commercial aspects, and that these things like possessions, money, pleasurable aspects of life are short-sighted for a couple reasons. One is the sort of the hedonic treadmill that has been demonstrated empirically that no matter how much stuff you have, you still want more stuff. That's the treadmill never stops running. And so that is a kind of empirical fact that these sorts of pursuit of happiness through things won't really ever do. It will never ever really be enough. And those studies that have demonstrated that are just secular empirical studies of happiness through the positive psychology question would be that it's not solely a matter of religious versus secular understanding. Even non-religious understandings of happiness realize that life is about more than that. And again, this is a very long, venerable heritage all the way back to Aristotle. But I do think the second part of my response to your question will be definitely religious traditions, and here I'm speaking really of the Bible and Christian theology, have a much more robust definition of happiness that's far beyond commercialistic, consumeristic capitalism. Yeah. It includes precisely those things you mentioned earlier. It includes aspects of true happiness that are self-denying, giving towards others, generosity towards others has been demonstrated to be a factor in people's increased happiness. And, of course, the Christian tradition has affirmed that sort of thing for a long, long time. So I do think there's definitely a more robust, thick definition of happiness in the Christian tradition and in the biblical materials than we typically say or mean when we say I'm happy about having this cereal for breakfast. That's a very thin definition of happiness. It's the same word, but it's very different than calling, say the Friday that Jesus was crucified, calling it Good Friday, right? These are very profoundly different understandings of what is the good or what is happy or what is happiness.
I want to talk about the relation possibly between happiness and purpose, because I think for most people they are somewhat related. And recently we had the presidential election here in the U.S., and most people vote just, Democrat or Republican, and both sides seem irreconcilable. You have the far left, you have the far right, and oftentimes you see that kind of schism when it comes to religious thought too. For example, I'm a believer in evolution, and as I said, I'm not personally religious, but I don't like a lot of the rhetoric that people like a Richard Dawkins have about social issues, calling all religious people stupid. But to me it seems that when I meet someone who's religious, and devoutly religious, they could be fundamentalists, they could be non-denominational and just have some kind of zeitgeist in them, they do seem to have more of an idea of purpose in their life that gives them some kind of happiness. And you can argue whether it's real happiness or delusional, but they do have that purpose that gives them happiness that someone who is just, say, a consumerist mall zombie that was parodied in a film like Dawn of the Dead many years ago does not have. And regardless of whether you're a right-winger or a left-winger, regardless of whether you're religious or not, there seems to be an interconnection between purpose and happiness. Would you agree with that? And if so, would you expand on it?
Yeah, I think that's right. And again, this goes back to Aristotle and his understanding of the kind of teleological nature of happiness. There was a telos to happiness. Part of that telos would be the cultivation of virtue. And preeminently for Aristotle, it was the virtue of having reason, being a reasonable person, being able to practice reason. In the biblical material, I think you can also find this to be the case, that there can be teleological aspects of happiness. So Nathan MacDonald, who wrote for the Bible and Pursuit of Happiness, traced this out in the Pentateuch, in the first 5 books of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, that in many ways show a story that's on the way to happiness. It's not fully there. It has moments of happiness, but also significant moments of unhappiness. But what's interesting about the Torah, vis-a-vis Aristotle and this notion of telos or purpose, is that the Torah, people of Israel never get to the promised land in the Torah. They end in Deuteronomy outside the promised land. Moses, the great leader, the one who is really the unsurpassed in the Old Testament in terms of his relationship with God and contact with God, and what he dies outside the promised land. So the telos of happiness is really beyond the Torah. It's future. And MacDonald points out this has a lot of resonance with Aristotle's notion of the telos or drive or goal of happiness. In fact, for Aristotle, you couldn't truly decide if someone was happy until they were dead. Because you had to see how they died, what kind of death they construal of a human life could you then pronounce, so-and-so was a truly happy person. So I think that you're exactly right. And maybe one further little caveat on this point is that the New Testament, too, is full of texts that talk about rather horrific experiences. Paul's suffering, or when the apostles are presented as being mistreated in the book of Acts. And like in Acts 5, after they're treated dishonorably, they rejoice. They rejoice that they were treated dishonorably. So this is very strange behavior. People don't normally rejoice that they've suffered or whatnot. And I think in these cases, Old and New Testament together, what you see again is a kind of larger eudaimonistic framework that's really connected to the goal of a person's life and their ability to find happiness in the sense that their happiness is a meaningfulness. This is something Martin Seligman has pointed out. There's happiness that's pleasure, and then there's happiness that's virtuous, and there's happiness that is meaningfulness. And it's only that kind of meaningfulness, and you're getting at it with this question of purpose, that can really redefine what are not hedonic, not pleasurable moments in life, yet redefine them as somehow part of the truly happy life.
Yeah, you mentioned telos, and that brought to mind to me the Greek myth of Sisyphus, wherein I forget which god Sisyphus offends, but he's basically, doomed to push a boulder up a hill and have it come down. But even more so, and a lot of people forget this, is that Sisyphus isn't just doomed to push the boulder, he's doomed to be happy to push the boulder up. And that brings the idea of free will and happiness. So how would you relate free will to notions of happiness?
Well, there's a lot in the study of happiness that does talk about sort of behavioral qualities to it and choice, right? So it's not uncommon to find books with titles like "Happiness is a Choice," "Choosing Happiness," this sort of business, and that makes a certain degree of sense. There are behavioral aspects in the empirical study of happiness that have demonstrated certain things people can do, right, that help facilitate their happiness. I think there's a massive amount of literature, too, especially from psychology, that shows that it's not always easy for people to choose happiness. And some people seem to be completely and clinically incapable of choosing it. So free will, or will to choose, is only part of the story. And I would say, in light of biblical text, a very small part of the story. There is, in a sense, to go back to our earlier language, there is a kind of pursuit of happiness that one does sort of strive for or pursue it, especially in these virtuous ways. But there's also a case in which there are facilitating factors that go into helping one be truly happy. And this circles back to this notion of the Declaration of Independence and the way the government can create facilitating environments that actually help its citizens become more happy. So institutions can be positive. This is a positive psychology movement's language. Institutions can be positive that help those part of be more happy. Families are the facilitating environments that can help people be more happy. And always with this language, the happiness that they're talking about, that we're talking about, is more than just pleasure, but the virtuous, thriving life. It's really about human flourishing, not just syrupy, sweet feelings all the time. So I do think that there's a kind of, again, a blend, one might say, between what one does personally and maybe in terms of the will and what is happening around oneself. The facilitating environment, the institutions one is a part of, the family one's a part, maybe the church one is a part of, and and how those factors and other environmental aspects contribute to and facilitate the happiness of any one individual.
Well, let's pick up on that in my next segment. I want to talk about modern ideas of happiness, medicalized happiness, and things like that, and we'll do that in a moment. Speaking about happiness with Brent Strawn, he edited a book called The Bible and the Pursuit of Happiness. You had mentioned some stuff, modern ideas of happiness, and that gets me thinking to a lot of the things that have occurred in the last 30 years, where it seems that a lot of people's behavior in the last 30 years has sort of been medicalized. If someone isn't happy all the time, let's give them a drug, especially children. I have a niece who's now 18 and going to be going to college, but when she was 3 or 4, I remember my sister telling me doctors said she was autistic. They wanted to give her a drug. I said, don't do that. You don't know what the consequences could be. See what happens. And she turned out perfectly fine. Kids that have all of these acronyms, everyone should be happy. Presidents tell us to go out and spend to be happy. Do you think, what is your idea basically on the modern culture of happiness, and that somehow if you're not happy all the time, there's something wrong with you medically, there's something wrong with you psychologically? Do you think that there's a cultural pathology that we have to strive for happiness, and that happiness is not even really what happiness is?
I do. I agree with that. In fact, the line that I like a lot, I'm going to paraphrase, I'm not going to get it exactly right, it's from Tal Ben-Shahar, which is Happiness at Harvard. In one of his books, talks about the only people that don't experience normal feelings of sadness and depression and pain and things like this, the kind of warp and woof of life. The only people that don't experience that are the pathological and the dead. And normal people don't want to be either one of those.
Yeah.
They don't want to be dead. They don't want to be pathological. In the Bible, The Pursuit of Happiness, William Brown pointed out that in the book of Psalms, the only people that don't experience sadness, the only people who are healthy and happy all the time, are the wicked. It's in Psalm 73. And in fact, the book of Psalms, which is full of the struggle of the righteous to live their lives, I mean, they're very candid, these psalmists, about their pain and suffering. So that the way to true happiness in the Psalms, and according to this psychological literature too, is never in denial of the real pains of life. It's not medicating oneself, but it's actually going through those things. So again, in the case of the Psalms, one doesn't get to new life in the Psalms by denial or cover up or by medicating, but by actually processing all those emotions and all that pain and suffering, and processing it in the Psalms in a religious way, in the confines and in the limits and context of prayer and worship to God, where all this is sort of vocalized to God. You could see it in one sense as a kind of ancient therapeutic practice, right? Where the deity is in a sense the therapist, hearing all supplicants' pain and letting that be worked through. It's kind of talk therapy, as it were, prayer therapy in this case. The talking cure, the praying cure in the case of the Psalms. But most definitely, the idea that we can just medicate or self-medicate to get to these pleasurable moments. This happens all the time, and we know that typically it's not a good result. There's people addicted to prescription meds. There's people addicted to alcohol. There's people addicted to, illegal drugs, all in a sense to sort of live a hedonistic aspect of happiness, which is only one and small part of happiness in a highly transient aspect of happiness. The pleasurable aspects of happiness come and go. The virtuous aspects of happiness, the meaningful aspects of happiness, those stay and can perdure even in the face of non-hedonic moments. In fact, those are the things because if it was only about pleasure, you would just have to end life the first time you hit a non-pleasurable moment.
Yeah, I just this morning when I got up, I had seen an article online where someone, a young millennial, was writing a lamentation about all the awards that he had won because they weren't real awards of accomplishment; they were awards for participating in something. Like he finished 49th in a marathon out of 250 people, and the top 50 got ribbons or more. And he basically said, well, I basically got a ribbon for not dropping dead while running the marathon. And I did a show last weekend that had a large part of it devoted to narcissism. Do you think that their modern culture has construed happiness to such a degree that it encourages narcissism to a degree?
I suspect so. I mean, I think that this is all bound up in modern American culture with a complex confluence of factors, some of which are psychological, some of which are market-driven, and that they combine to really identify the self with what the self achieves or what the self owns. But the common factor in those things is, of course, the self. And one of the things that has been shown repeatedly in the positive psychology literature, the empirical study of happiness, is that it is, in fact, generosity towards others, it's gratitude towards others, factors like volunteer work, factors like religion. These have been positively correlated empirically with greater happiness, greater reports of subjective well-being on the part of those who are being tested. They report greater, more positive subjective well-being if they're generous, if they are thankful, if they are religious, in these ways that move them, therefore, outside of just the self and concern with the self. Of course, that's not to say that the self isn't important, right? It's the self who does these things, and we have to be wary of solely, again, an ascetic or self-denying, or even worse, self-punishing or self-flagellating kind of approach to happiness. That's clearly not happiness either, because that misses all aspects of the hedonic elements in happiness, some of which are there and real.
Yeah, I was going to go on to that next to get back to more religious stuff. Of the major religions, and even if you know of some of the minor religions, you mentioned asceticism, and most people would think of Mahatma Gandhi in that aspect. Do most of religious thought, whether it's East or West, do they have similar ideas of what happiness is, or are there greatly contrasting ideas? Because I know, for example, the sort of, caricatured version of East versus West is that in the West, people seek happiness by becoming, and in the West, it's by becoming, and in the East, it's by being. And that, to me, seems oversimplified and demeaning to both sides.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in the Eastern religions, so I don't want to misrepresent them at all. But I do think it's important to point out that the Dalai Lama has been one of the kind of primary people who've talked a lot about happiness and is a major figure in the happiness movement. And so there are differences in the major religions, and as you say, the minor religions on these sorts of things. And we shouldn't overlook them, shouldn't collapse them all together. And so I think that's a point that's well taken. And my own work is primarily with the traditions of Christianity and Judaism, and particularly as reflected in texts.
I think I mentioned earlier about the idea of accomplishment, and just thinking about this participation kind of medals that have come up, especially in educational circles of the last couple of decades. Do you think that there is a sense of happiness that is based in some kind of real accomplishment? and it doesn't necessarily have to be, serving at a charity function every weekend or whatnot. But if you write an especially cogent book that a lot of people contact you on, or if you're, a bridge builder that builds a bridge between two towns that makes commerce and produces economic benefit, is that something that is somehow a better type of happiness than, say, the person who simply has a positive outlook, either by genetic influence or by religious conversion?
Well, I think in the most robust definition of happiness, it would be sort of all of the above. Wouldn't mark one person.
You're fading a little bit, Brent. Can you come a little bit closer?
Sure.
Yeah.
I think that in the most robust definition of happiness, it would be all of the above, right?
Yeah.
It would be not just one's accomplishments, not just one's positive outlook, but some combination thereof. And presumably, these would be interrelated factors. I was thinking back to the earliest discussions of happiness. When Aristotle's talking about happiness, he refers back to Solon and King Croesus of Sardis.
Yeah.
And when Croesus is the king of Sardis, and he asks the philosopher Solon who's the happiest person in the world, and this is after the king shows Solon all of his treasures, and Solon doesn't tell the king what the king hopes, which is you are, obviously, but instead tells him the story of an Athenian named Tellus, and everything that Solon says about Tellus has to do not with his treasures, but with other aspects as well. So he lived in a famous city, he had good and noble children, he saw his children and grandchildren survive him. He was well off by our standards of living, Solon said, and he ended his life in the greatest glory, dying nobly on the battlefield. So this Athenian Tellus, he had stuff, he had accomplishments, presumably economic accomplishments, plus he had accomplishments in battle. He also had accomplishments, as it were, with his family, but also had other factors that were not accomplishments. They were out of his control. The furniture of fortune is what Aristotle called it. He happened to live in a famous city, and his children, also happened to turn out really well, and his grandchildren as well. So there's, I think, this combination of factors. And one of the things that I left this project with, a major takeaway, is that in most of our contemporary discussions of happiness, I think what we're discussing is a greatly reduced, thin, and polluted form of the word happiness. And the difficulty in wrapping our minds around the good life and the happy life is trying to come up with a thicker, more robust definition of happiness and constantly have that in mind when we're talking about the subject. Because when we use the word happy and happiness now, we just think about the most simplistic forms about that. And those forms won't do when the going gets rough.
Yeah, I want to get to the project in your book in a moment, but you're bringing up the telos and the dying on the battlefield. Of course, that to me brings to mind 9/11 and the 71 virgins that jihadists believe await for them. It also brought to mind the World War I poet Wilfred Owen and his poem Dulce et Decorum est pro patria mori, and he calls it, the biggest of all lies, this sort of nationalist fervor. Do you think that things like that are delusional in the happiness that they may give temporarily, this nationalism, this I must be right, I must fight for my religion, my country, my this, and that kind of a pursuit of happiness is actually malignant?
That's a good question. It's hard to say, because in some ways the telos...
I'm sorry, can you come a little closer again?
It's hard to say, I think partly because the telos question relates to how we evaluate the telos in question, right? I mean, so some of us greatly support the notion of military service, service on behalf of the country. And this is a great positive virtue in American civil religion, that one would give of oneself for the greater good of the society. So how we evaluate the telos in question will indicate whether we think the rhetoric and all the rest is malignant or not. I think it's true that in the case of someone like the Apostle Paul, or some visions of apocalyptic happiness, that it's the larger goal that does allow someone to actually deal with temporary suffering or non-pleasurable experiences, because in service to that greater good, that larger framework, that future telos. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't evaluate the telos in question. Is it a virtuous one itself? Is it worthwhile? I mean, if the end vision is just so that I can be happy in paradise, right? Then we might perceive that to be narcissistic and again overly focused on just the singular self. Or is the vision a larger one that's for the greater good of the polis or the entire world? That would probably be deemed by more people to be a good telos or a better telos, because it's concerned with more people than just the individual self.
The Bible and the Pursuit of Happiness is the book that you edited. You said that it came out of a project. What was this project, and was the book the end purpose of it?
Yeah, so there was a larger project called Pursuit of Happiness more generally at Emory University through the Center for the Study of Law and Religion, which brought together a number of people in different fields to study the notion of happiness and positive psychology from different angles over the course of 3 or 4 years. That project is still publishing its results, but my project emerged out of that. There were funds available, and so we put together a conference called The Bible and the Pursuit of Happiness. And 2 of the participants in the original group, who were biblical scholars, participated in our group. We had 5 Old Testament scholars, 4 New Testament scholars, and 3 others who represent different fields. One was a systematic theologian, one was a practical theologian, a professor of preaching, and the third was himself a psychologist. And so all these came together for a conference here in Atlanta for several days. We presented papers, had respondents, had general discussion. After that, the folk got to go home and revise their papers and send them in, and I edited the whole and wrote, as I said, a number of items myself throughout the book. And so that was kind of how the conference came to be and how it was executed with regard to both biblical scholars and these 3 respondents who take the conversation beyond the Bible proper.
Were there any major clashes, or were there any things that in the pursuit of this book and project that you learned that you had not an idea of before?
Yeah, I think I learned a lot of things, and one was something I mentioned earlier, which was this idea that happiness as a term seems to have been polluted in common discussion. It's been greatly thinned down, and what we have is a very reduced form of topic and aspect of life that is complicated and complex and needs to be thought of and spoken of in those sorts of ways. So when we set out to finish the essays, one of the things I wanted contributors to do was to constantly have these things in mind. They were writing, of course, from their areas of expertise about the Bible, primarily, but they were also to take into account the insights about happiness that have been won over the years through the positive psychology movement. And they were also trying to reckon with, thirdly and lastly, trying to reckon with this problem of the pollution of the word happiness. So what does happiness mean in light of their biblical text, their specialized disciplines, and then in light of what we've learned about happiness from each essay brings out some really fascinating insights about how happiness is best defined vis-a-vis the specific focus of that essay, and also with this kind of contribution to modern notions of happiness and the positive psychology.
In science, there's a term called qualia, which means basically that people can sense different things. If you and I are both walking down a street and we see a stop sign, we'll both say that it's red, but there seems to be no way that I can actually know that the red that I am seeing is the red that you're seeing. My red may be what you call yellow. Now, I think this is just a philosophical kind of, interesting question, because I mean, certain rods and cones in the eye, in the cornea or the back of the eye, wherever they are, will be activated in both of our eyes, and it's highly, highly likely that we'll both see red or whatnot. But assuming that there is that qualitative unknowability of things, is it kind of hubristic to say, well, if this person is happy by playing with vintage era 100-year-old train sets all day, that their happiness is worthless and not worth pursuing for them?
Right. No, I wouldn't necessarily think so. I mean, I think that this is one of the things that positive psychology has to wrestle with, which is the subjective nature of happiness and reports of subjective well-being. So when Seligman initiated the positive psychology movement, when he became president of the American Psychological Association in 1998, one of the things he insisted on was that positive psychology should be empirical. It should be scientific. And so studies of happiness in the positive psychology movement are, if they're worth their name and worth their song, are to be empirically based. Even so, these are social sciences, right? So they're not exactly like mixing something up in the lab, and so it's still based on reports of subjective well-being, and therefore, of course, it is subjective. It's a part of the subjects who are reporting this. So that's in that sense not objective and whatnot, but the goal, I think, is to have enough studies, and especially long-term studies, cross-cultural studies, that show enough points of convergence that you can say some things about happiness that are not purely momentary and completely overturnable. And so to go back to the person playing with the trains, this would be definitely probably if they reported subjective well-being about this, then you would have to take that seriously. Whether or not that's the most robust form of happiness could be debated in light of other empirical studies, right? That would say people who give to others, volunteer their time, who are generous, who are thankful, etc., don't just play with trains, are also happy. And it definitely would be out of line with most extensive discussions of happiness in the Western philosophical and theological tradition, which always have pointed out that happiness is more than just subjective well-being. So I think that would be how I would go about that particular example.
Do you think that religion or religious fervor or faith is the best or one of the best ways to achieve happiness? Even, let's say, if we could empirically prove that there was no God, say, do you think that it's empirically provable, though, that people that are religious are on a faster track, say, to happiness? And if so, can you make that argument?
Well, the literature that I am aware of in the positive psychology movement has demonstrated that people who pray and who are religious do report higher levels of subjective well-being. But as I understand that literature, it's not drastically different, right? It's not that someone who is not religious can't report similarly high levels of subjective well-being. But in the aggregate, people who pray or have religious affiliation, those are positively correlated with high levels of subjective well-being. So it's a factor. It's not the only factor. And I suspect that if it is a factor, and this literature indicates that it is, it has to do with this larger framework, which you could use the language of Winnicott, the facilitating environment, or you could use the language of a kind of a eudaimonistic framework that then can house within it moments of hedonism and non-hedonism, or this is the telos or meaningful aspect of religion, of happiness and the virtuous life. But I don't think that religion is the only way that one gets there, right? And Aristotle was not religious in that sense, and many people who work on happiness now are not religious in this sense. And many people who work on happiness now aren't really even like necessarily overtly happy people. I mean, Christopher Peterson, who wrote on happiness for Oxford, says this about himself, that he's a researcher on happiness, and he thinks he's a happy person by these larger, richer definitions. But if you just met him, it's not like he's laughing all the time or smiling. He's fairly stern and whatnot, is how he describes himself. So religion, I think, is one way towards getting at those larger, meaningful frameworks, facilitating environments, positive institutions. And so I think that is a beneficial aspect of religion that does correlate positively with higher levels of subjective well-being.
Well, let's end the segment at that, and in the final segment I will give you some moments to wrap up your thoughts and have one more or two more questions, and we'll do that in a moment. I have been speaking with Emory University Professor Brent Strawn. He has edited a book on happiness in the Bible. I will link to his page and also to the book below this video. You can contact him if you've appreciated his speech. Let me just ask a little bit, a couple of questions, and then give you some final thoughts on happiness itself. Do you consider yourself a happy person? If so, why? And how have you gotten there? And if not, how are you getting there?
That's great. I think so. I think overall, I would consider myself a happy person by means of these definitions. I think, to be honest, right, I've had a really fortunate life according to Aristotle's categories. Born in a famous city, as Herodotus said, San Diego, California is not where I was born, but where I was raised. Not a bad place to be raised in terms of the climate. And a family, good family, and a positive religious experience as a young person, wonderful wife, good kids, etc. A nice job at a great institution. So these sorts of furniture of fortune, that much of which was out of my control, that Aristotle discusses, is played out very well for me. But like anyone, I have my own wonderings about life and struggles in life, and not all of those are pleasurable. And so one has to figure out how all that works together. And so for me, working on this project has been helpful because it shows yet again the blending of what we would call hedonic and anhedonic, pleasurable and non-pleasurable, or simplistically enjoyable and non-enjoyable but meaningful parts of life together. And I think that's ultimately what makes a good life. So my version of the happy life is, I think, not just brought about the fact that by the fact that I enjoy life, I enjoy my kids, I enjoy my job, I crack a few jokes along the way, etc. But in that I'm trying to be a virtuous person, and certainly my own religiosity figures into that in my desire to be a virtuous person and to live a happy and virtuous life with others.
Yeah, I've often thought that a lot of these people who strive to be happy are, in a sense, have a psychotic pursuit, because you can't have beauty without ugliness. You can't really, to me, appreciate happiness unless you do go through what used to be called melancholia. And I talked about medicalizing things, and I think, certainly if someone has manic depression and it's extreme, that's a bad thing. But if you lose a job, if you break up with someone, if your mother is just diagnosed with cancer, and you're going around smiling and happy as a bug, there's something wrong with you.
Right.
So let me just give you a couple of minutes, if you can, sort of just sum up your thoughts on happiness as well.
Yeah, well, I do want to reiterate that I think when we talk about complex subjects, it's going to take a while to get them said right. And I appreciate this opportunity to talk to you, Dan, because the discussion of the Bible and happiness, or just happiness by itself, is going to take some time to be able to articulate in a way that's meaningful. You can do sound bites, you can do Twitter posts, but they're just not going to do justice to something that's as complicated as the human life and the human experience of life. And so I am very dubious of and disappointed in religious practitioners who promise easy fixes to complex notions of life, manic depression, or the loss of loved ones, or chronic illness, or terminal illness for that matter, where you can just sort of change a switch in your brain and start believing differently and feeling differently. I'm very dubious about that, because I think that happiness, true happiness, in this robust discussion that's now not just philosophical, but now psychological, theological, this happiness is such a thick, complicated topic that no one set by you're going to need more than 140 characters. You're going to have to talk about it in more than one way. And so thickening things up is really a crucial thing for people. And realizing that one doesn't get to true happiness without experiencing true pain and suffering. This is part of life. And if you don't experience those parts of life, it's because you're either psychotic, or you're dead, or you're over-treated, you're over-medicalized.
Yeah.
So moving through the difficulties of life towards this larger, robust, happy life is what it's all about. In the book, I ended the volume with my contribution called The Triumph of Life Towards a Biblical Theology of Happiness. And there I picked up on a line that I first heard in the Jurassic Park movie, where the chaos theorist, Dr. Malcolm, says, life finds a way. And I think that that's one of my main takeaways from the study of happiness and studying happiness through the Bible, is that life, the virtuous, the happy life, finds a way even through those painful moments. You don't get to that end goal, that happy life, by denying that, but actually as part of it. And that can be presented in simple ways that are true to form. So as I was working on the book, my youngest son was only 4 years old, and he had a little kid's Bible, and these kids' Bibles are oftentimes silly and syrupy. But this one had a line in it that stuck with me that talked about Israel's hard and happy history. Hard and history. And I thought, that's exactly right. Hard and happy. And not just two things, but if you use a linguistic term, a hendiadys, those two things together. That was one of the key takeaways for me, that happiness is not apart from the hard or difficult aspects of life, but precisely through them. So I find hard and happy is right on, especially if we understand it as a hendiadys, as one thing spoken of through two words.
Well, I will link to both your book on Amazon as well as your page at Emory. People can contact you there. I think it was a great discussion, and you had mentioned these sort of what I call snake oil salesmen. I think too much of modern life, you have this sort of Oprahification of life, where you get the Tony Robbinses and the Deepak Chopra types that just don't really deal with the real world. So it was a pleasure to speak to you, and good luck in the future.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for